History is written by the victors, but what if the truth is written in our very bones? For centuries, a mysterious sarcophagus lay hidden, its occupant simply labeled the unknown ruler. Historians had their theories, of course. Was he a forgotten pharaoh, a usurper king, a foreign conqueror? The texts were silent, the tomb offered few clues, and the ruler's identity was lost to the sands of time. But now, cutting-edge science is about to give a voice to the voiceless. Welcome to the ultimate cold case. Our story begins in a high-security lab, where a small team of geneticists and archaeologists were granted unprecedented access. Their mission, to extract DNA from the ruler's remains, a task fraught with challenges. Ancient DNA is fragile, often contaminated and degraded over millennia. The first attempts were agonizing. Failure after failure mounted, and the team feared the ruler's secrets would remain locked away forever. But then, a breakthrough. Using a revolutionary new technique, they successfully isolated and sequenced a significant portion of the genome. The moment the first results appeared on screen, a stunned silence fell over the lab. The data was about to rewrite history. The first surprise was the ruler's maternal line. It traced back not to the local royal families as everyone expected, but to a distant, nomadic tribe from the frigid northern steppes, a people completely absent from this region's historical records. How did a woman from a tribe thousands of miles away end up in the heart of a powerful empire, and how did her son ascend to the throne? The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic community. The established timelines, the carefully constructed family trees of the elite, it all began to crumble. This wasn't just a new chapter. It was a completely different book. But the paternal line held an even bigger bombshell. The Y chromosome analysis linked the unknown ruler directly to the empire's most celebrated dynasty. The very same dynasty that historical accounts claimed had been wiped out in a bloody civil war, a generation asterisk. Before asterisk, this ruler was born. It was impossible. The official narrative stated that the royal line was severed, that a new ruling family had taken over. Yet here was the proof, encoded in the ruler's very cells. A direct, male line descendant of the extinct dynasty was on the throne. This wasn't just a forgotten king. This was a ghost, a secret survivor who had reclaimed his family's legacy. So what really happened? The genetic evidence paints a dramatic new picture. A prince, thought to have perished in the coup, must have been smuggled to safety. He likely grew up in exile, perhaps among the northern tribes his mother came from. He would have bided his time forging alliances, and then returned not as a conqueror, but as a silent contender, reclaiming his birthright under a new identity. He ruled, died, and was buried, his true story deliberately obscured to protect his lineage from his family's old enemies. The silence in the historical texts wasn't an omission. It was a strategy. A lie to protect the truth. The case of the unknown ruler is a powerful reminder that history is not a static collection of facts, but a living, breathing story that is constantly evolving. What we think we know can be appended by a single strand of DNA. It makes you wonder, how many other secrets are buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the right tools to bring them to light? What other historical truths are actually elaborate deceptions? The past is never truly past, and sometimes the dead have the most incredible stories to tell. Thanks for watching. If you found this as fascinating as we did, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more journeys into the unknown. In a sealed chamber buried beneath layers of earth and silence, archaeologists uncovered a discovery that did not match any known record of history. The tomb was intact, undisturbed, untouched for centuries. And yet the body inside did not belong to any ruler documented in royal archives, inscriptions, or historical texts. At first glance, it appeared to be the remains of a high-status individual. The preservation was unusually advanced. The burial positioning was ceremonial. The artifacts surrounding the body suggested power, authority, and deliberate ritual significance. But there was one problem. No name. No inscription identifying the ruler. No symbols matching any recorded dynasty. No historical reference linking this individual to any known civilization leader. This alone was unusual. In ancient cultures, rulers were rarely buried anonymously. Their identities were often engraved into stone, sealed in records, or immortalized through symbolic markers. The absence of such identifiers raised immediate questions among researchers. Why would a ruler be buried with honor, yet without identity? As the excavation team documented the tomb structure, Another detail began to stand out. The construction techniques used in the chamber showed a blend of architectural patterns that did not strictly align with one known cultural period. The stone alignment, tool marks, and internal sealing methods suggested advanced planning and intentional isolation. It was not a rushed burial. It was engineered concealment. The body itself was preserved in a manner that suggested deliberate care, not decay management. The wrappings, positioning, and environmental sealing indicated that whoever arranged this burial understood long-term preservation techniques. This was not accidental preservation. It was intentional. Soon after the remains were transported to a controlled research facility, forensic teams initiated a standard historical preservation analysis. Initial surface scans revealed no visible trauma, no obvious signs of violent death, and no irregular skeletal deformation that could immediately explain the anonymity. But then came the decision that changed the direction of the investigation: a full DNA analysis. This step is rarely taken for unidentified ancient remains unless there is strong reason to historical significance. In this case, the combination of ceremonial burial, unknown identity, and preservation quality justified deeper examination. Researchers carefully extracted viable genetic material, using sterile protocols designed to prevent contamination. The samples were cross-referenced with existing genetic databases compiled from ancient population studies, regional lineage mapping, and archaeological DNA records. The expectation was simple: to identify the geographic and cultural origin of the individual. However, the preliminary analysis did not produce a straightforward match. Instead, the genetic markers displayed an unusual distribution pattern that did not fully align with the dominant population profiles of the surrounding historical region. This did not mean the individual was anomalous in a supernatural sense, as some might exaggerate. Rather, it suggested something more academically intriguing: possible migration, unrecorded lineage, or a ruling class that was historically undocumented. Further examination of the burial artifacts added another layer of complexity. The materials found in the tomb included ceremonial items typically associated with high authority, but their stylistic elements were inconsistent with a single cultural signature. Some design motifs reflected one historical tradition, while others hinted at influences from distant regions. This raised a logical hypothesis among historians. Was this ruler connected to a transitional period in history that was never fully documented? Or perhaps part of a lineage that existed outside mainstream recorded dynasties? The environmental sealing of the tomb also indicated intentional historical isolation. Unlike many royal tombs designed for legacy and remembrance, this chamber appeared designed for permanence without public recognition. It was hidden, not displayed. Preserved, but not proclaimed. This contradiction puzzled researchers. Powerful enough to receive ceremonial burial, important enough to be preserved, yet absent from every major historical record. As imaging technology progressed, high-resolution scans of the skeletal structure revealed proportional features consistent with elite nutritional status, suggesting access to resources and structured living conditions. This further reinforced the theory that the individual held significant status during their lifetime. But status without identity in ancient contexts is statistically rare. Historians began reviewing lesser-known historical gaps, periods of political transition, undocumented conflicts, and fragmented dynastic records where entire leadership lines may have been lost due to war, cultural shifts, or deliberate erasure. Meanwhile, genetic researchers continued refining the DNA sequencing results. Each layer of analysis aimed not to make dramatic claims, but to narrow probabilities based on measurable data. Early indicators suggested lineage complexity rather than simplicity. Not a random individual, not a common burial, and certainly not an ordinary historical figure. The tomb's geographical placement added another dimension to the mystery. Located at a strategic depth and distance from major known burial sites, it suggested deliberate separation rather than accidental discovery placement. This implied planning, resources, and coordinated effort during the burial process. In other words, this ruler was not forgotten by accident. They may have been hidden by design. As documentation continued, researchers maintained a cautious scientific stance. No absolute conclusions were announced. No exaggerated claims were made. Every observation was framed as a working hypothesis rather than a definitive statement. Because in archaeology and historical genetics, interpretation without sufficient evidence risks distorting historical understanding. Yet, one fact remained undeniable. The discovery challenged assumptions about how thoroughly ancient leadership records have been preserved. If a ruler of such apparent importance could exist outside documented history, it raised a broader academic question. How much of ancient history remains incomplete? And more importantly, what happens when modern scientific tools begin analyzing remains that traditional historical records never acknowledged? The sealed tomb had already rewritten one expectation, that all rulers leave identifiable traces in history. But as the DNA analysis moved into deeper sequencing phases, researchers prepared for the possibility that the genetic data might reveal connections no historical inscription ever recorded. And if that happened, the identity of this unknown ruler would not just be an archaeological curiosity. It would become a scientific mystery capable of reshaping how historians interpret lost lineages, undocumented leadership, and the silent gaps that exist between recorded civilizations. Because sometimes, history is not erased loudly. Sometimes it is buried quietly, preserved carefully, and rediscovered centuries later, waiting for science, not inscriptions, to begin telling its story. As the initial documentation phase concluded, the research focus shifted from discovery to contextual investigation. Identifying the historical placement of the tomb became the next logical step, as no archaeological finding exists in isolation. Every burial site, construction method, and artifact arrangement reflects the cultural systems of its time. The chamber's architecture was examined in detail using structural mapping and comparative archaeological modeling. At first, analysts expected alignment with a known regional burial tradition. However, the construction revealed a blend of techniques that did not fully correspond to a single documented civilization. The stone layering method suggested advanced planning, while the internal sealing mechanism indicated a deliberate attempt to prevent environmental intrusion over long periods. This was not the work of an improvised burial team. It was systematic, intentional, strategically engineered. Historians began cross-referencing the chamber's design with burial sites from multiple ancient periods, looking for parallels in layout, material usage, and ceremonial positioning. Some similarities emerged, but none were definitive enough to classify the tomb under a known dynastic framework. Meanwhile, the artifacts recovered from the site underwent independent cataloging. Each object was photographed, preserved, and analyzed for material composition, symbolic markings, and stylistic patterns. Among the items were ceremonial ornaments, fragments of textile wrappings, and tools that appeared to hold ritual significance rather than practical use. What stood out was the symbolic inconsistency. In traditional royal burials, symbols are usually uniform, reinforcing identity, lineage, and cultural authority. Here, the symbols lacked repetition. Some motifs resembled regional insignias from one historical culture, while others appeared stylistically distant from that same tradition. This suggested one of three academic possibilities: cultural convergence, migration-linked leadership, or a ruler operating during a historically unstable transitional era. To investigate further, researchers consulted fragmented historical records from surrounding regions, focusing on undocumented leadership gaps. Ancient political transitions often resulted in incomplete archives, especially during periods of conflict, territorial shifts, or dynastic collapse. Entire leadership figures could disappear from official records if their reign was brief, contested, or intentionally erased by successor regimes. This theory gained traction when timeline estimations of the tomb's age were compared with known historical disruptions in the region. Radiometric dating of organic materials within the burial suggested a time frame that overlapped with a poorly documented historical period marked by administrative instability and incomplete archival continuity. In simple terms, the tomb may belong to a ruler from a historical gap, not fictional, not mythical, but historically unrecorded due to lost documentation. Further examination of the burial posture reinforced the assumption of elite status. The body had been positioned with ceremonial symmetry, surrounded by objects placed with spatial precision rather than random arrangement. This level of burial organization is typically reserved for individuals of political or spiritual significance within structured societies. Yet the absence of inscriptions remained the most unusual factor. Ancient civilizations placed immense importance on legacy preservation. Names, titles, and achievements were often carved into stone or encoded through symbolic representation. The complete lack of identifiable markings suggested that either the identity was deliberately withheld or the burial tradition followed an unconventional protocol. Archaeologists also analyzed soil composition within the chamber to determine whether the tomb had been relocated or constructed at its discovery site. The results indicated that the burial was original to the location, not transported. This ruled out theories suggesting secondary burial or later concealment through relocation. Simultaneously, textile analysis of the wrappings revealed high-quality fiber processing techniques uncommon in ordinary burials. The weaving density, preservation method, and layering technique pointed towards specialized craftsmanship, implying access to skilled artisans in structured burial planning. This detail alone challenged the notion that the individual was socially insignificant. Anonymous burials are rarely elaborate. Attention then turned to geopolitical context. Historians reconstructed regional power structures during the estimated time period, mapping trade routes, cultural exchanges, and territorial governance patterns. Evidence suggested that the region may have served as a convergence zone where multiple cultural influences intersected due to trade, migration, or political alliances. If true, the unknown ruler may not belong to a single cultural lineage, but rather to a hybrid administrative authority operating across cultural boundaries. This would explain mixed symbolic artifacts, non-uniform burial markers, and the absence of conventional dynastic identification. Another investigative angle involved examining lesser-known historical texts and fragmented inscriptions from peripheral archives. While major royal records did not reference an unnamed ruler matching the burial's timeframe, several indirect references to unregistered leadership transitions were found in secondary historical commentaries. These records were vague, often mentioning administrative shifts without naming specific figures. While not conclusive, such references suggested that historical continuity during that era may not have been fully preserved. The preservation environment inside the chamber also provided valuable contextual clues. Temperature stabilization patterns and controlled air sealing indicated advanced understanding of environmental preservation. This level of foresight implies that those responsible for the burial expected long-term historical significance, even if the identity was not publicly recorded. In essence, the burial was designed to endure time, not to communicate identity. Researchers then performed micro-residue analysis on the artifacts, identifying trace elements linked to ceremonial substances often associated with elite burial rituals. These substances were rare and typically reserved for high-ranking individuals, further reinforcing the conclusion that the buried individual held considerable authority during their lifetime. Yet the contradiction remained unresolved. High-status burial, advanced preservation, zero historical identification. As investigative reports accumulated, the academic consensus shifted away from simplistic explanations. Rather than labeling the discovery as an anomaly, experts began framing it as a potential example of historical incompleteness, a reminder that recorded history represents only a fraction of lived reality. The absence of identity in this case did not necessarily indicate insignificance. It may indicate selective historical loss. Scholars also considered the possibility of deliberate historical omission. Throughout history, political restructuring has occasionally led to the erasure of prior rulers from official records. Successor regimes, ideological shifts, or administrative reforms sometimes resulted in the removal of inconvenient leadership figures from formal archives. If such an event occurred during the ruler's era, it could explain why no direct inscriptions or documented lineage references survived in mainstream historical texts. Meanwhile, laboratory teams continued coordinating with historians to align archaeological findings with genetic data progression. While the DNA analysis was still undergoing deeper sequencing, preliminary contextual findings had already transformed the nature of the investigation. This was no longer a simple unidentified burial. It had evolved into a multidisciplinary inquiry involving archaeology, historical reconstruction, material science, and genetic research. Each discipline contributed a piece of the puzzle, yet none provided a definitive identity. And perhaps that was the most significant realization emerging from the investigation so far. History, as preserved in records, inscriptions, and official narratives, is not always complete. Some figures may have held power, influenced regions, and shaped events without leaving direct documentation that survives into modern archives. The tomb of the unknown ruler was not just an archaeological discovery. It was a challenge to the assumption that all influential figures are permanently recorded in historical memory. As contextual analysis reached its preliminary conclusion, attention increasingly shifted toward the pending DNA sequencing results. Because while artifacts and architecture could suggest status and era, only genetic data could potentially reveal lineage connections, migratory origins, and biological affiliations that historical records failed to capture. And if the genetic profile did not align with known royal lineages or regional populations, the implications would extend far beyond identity. They would raise deeper questions about undocumented leadership structures, migration-linked governance, and the silent historical gaps that traditional records never fully explained. The investigation had moved from discovery to context. The next phase would move from context to biological evidence,